What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
The following audio is courtesy of CNN Money, available on YouTube.
I do me every day. I take care of myself, I take care of my lady and my friends, and we take care of each other out here, and we survive out here.
I've actually only been homeless for 2 or 3 months, and I didn't have a bad childhood. I had parents that are still together. When I was a teenager, I started dealing with depression issues, and that led to eventually to drugs, and then drugs led me to here. I am less than a year away from having a bachelor's degree, but it was just very expensive. Just a bunch of blankets and sleeping bags, and we have a cooler to put the food that we get in. Really nice people come back and give us a lot of food and toiletries and things like that, and I'm really thankful for that. Tent City is just a community of tents of different people that are, at a situation in their life where, they're on the streets, and it's better than being alone out there, sleeping under a bridge or whatever. You actually have some kind of sense of community.
Unofficially, they call me the mayor. I just make sure, everything stays calm back here and people get what they need. Of course, everybody knows where to find me anyway. When I first came back here, there was only 3 people. Now there's 17. We used to have 30 people back here. And it's just, a place to go, a place to call home until you get out of here. My personal in-pocket income, I was making between $80,000 and $150,000 a year every year. Things happen. The economy happened. Fuel prices went up. I lost my contracts. The companies that got my contracts are still in business, and I'm not. I managed to hold on to everything for 4 years after everything started going bad. And then 2012 is when everything ended. That's when I ended up out here.
Any paraphernalia out? If not, I show them the house. They were taking people through the temporary rental assistance, and a pedophile got in there, but I couldn't. They denied me because I'm a murderer, so. And everybody looks at me, and that's my major downfall. They see somebody got bodies, and then you're automatically, they don't want to hear your story. They don't want to know. I mean, 2 guys raped my old lady, I whacked them. You know what I mean? End of story. Any man worth his salt would have done the same. I did 22 and a half years straight, got out of prison, was institutionalized. Knew that I went in when I was 18, knew nothing but, what they taught me in prison. 14 years. Well, not here, but in the area, 14 years.
The streets aren't safe, especially here.
I had somebody open fire on me with a 45. It was from about 20 feet away. I don't know how those bullets missed me.
In this city, the drug influence here is enormous. It's actually pretty bad. That's what I get to listen to all day long. So I avoid it by staying to myself all day. Honestly, I'm looking for work, trying to get out of here. I've been looking for work for 2 years.
So when's the last time you were employed?
Legally? Never. I've never had a legal, everything's under the table.
It's not a good situation. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, I'll tell you that much.
I have family that's will bring me back at any time, and that's what I'm gonna do. But you have to be mentally prepared, and I'm in the process of getting mentally prepared to do that.
Woo! We buy propane. I have a heater, propane heater.
I wake up every morning with frozen shoes. It feels like I'm putting on wooden clogs, but and it's freezing cold every night, but you deal with it. We deal with it when you have to.
there's a respect that you don't go into, you don't steal from another homeless person, nothing like that.
He decided one day that he wanted my propane canister. So he came and he ripped the door off of my tent that was locked and took the propane out in the middle of the day and took it to his tent. And then left me with a tent that I can't close at night.
Yeah, I went over there and took my boys. The dude you was just talking to, I told him, I said, look, man, I need some propane. He said, well, I can't do it right now, I gotta go. I cut his lock off. I went and took his propane. He came back and got it a couple hours later. You know what I mean? Gotta keep warm. He got compensated for it.
He's the most awful human being I've ever met in my life. And he stays about 10 feet that way. But the other people, you know, they're in survival mode. So they'll do selfish things, but you know, you gotta remember that we're out here with nothing, and I kind of understand where they're coming from, even when they do things that you would consider messed up. But you can tell who's a good person and who's not. And there are a lot of good people out here who are just in bad situations.
Welcome back to America Trends Podcast. John Krofsick and Larry Rifkin. And our topic today, John, is one that has been with us for a long period of time. And it's one of those topics that you think we as a society should be able to figure this out, and yet we haven't been able to. And that's making certain that people aren't living on the streets.
Well, we've been working on this since the 60s. You think we can solve it. But it's frustrating. It really is frustrating.
Well, in the state of Connecticut where we live, we're told that there are no more homeless veterans, and we've eliminated that. I don't even know how we can say that definitively. I'm not certain whether, in fact, they've been able to cast a wide net and figure out that there's nobody on the streets today in Connecticut, because there are many people on the streets. I've been to the shelter here in the city from which we broadcast and podcast, and I've seen beds of about 125 that are being occupied every night by otherwise homeless individuals.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame. And I think as a country, as a state, we need to look at the programs and see what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, because we really should be able to solve this problem. We should be able to, at least help these people, and then hopefully take them to the next level where they can at least get jobs and get back on track.
There's a song by the band, and I'll never forget, the lyric goes something like this: should I be arrested for the crime of having nowhere to go? And that's from the song The Shape I'm In. And in fact, people are being arrested for the crime of having nowhere to go. And it's not their fault in many cases, because we're not building enough low-income housing for all the people who need it in so many communities. I mean, look at some of these cities, John. When I go into New York City, I wonder, where do the people who sell the pretzels on the street, who clean the toilets at Grand Central, where do they afford to live anywhere near Manhattan?
In New York City, no, I can't believe that they do. I mean, it's just that it's astronomical what they cost to live
right.
in
So
a
where do they
closet
go?
in New York.
I know, but John, you have all these service workers. Where are they going at night?
Yeah, that's a good question. I never thought about that.
Well, imprisoning people for their lack of physical accommodation, that to me is a travesty. And then we've got a thing going on in America today where not only are we at times trying to get them out of our sight, a lot of people consider it unsightly. So all these encampments that seem to be growing in number. Now, I don't know if that surprises you, John, but that's what our report today is going to be telling our listeners. It's growing. It's not subsiding. But we're also starting to arrest people in America, across America, who in fact are trying to help these people. Now, can you imagine that?
Well, that is unbelievable. I know those encampments. When my daughter was working in Waterbury, we had people sleeping in tubes. We had people sleeping down by the river. I mean, so I know they exist, and I know they're growing. And I don't know. We just got to do something about this. But what we have in place now doesn't seem to be working. It just seems like, everybody's doing their thing, but nobody's really getting ahead in the system, and I think that's the biggest problem.
And John, it's a confluence of things. You've got a lack of affordable housing. You've got mental health issues that are unaddressed. You've got people who are not making a living wage. You've got a lot of things that are conspiring in a manner that leaves people really out in the cold, literally. So we're going to be talking to Eric Tars. He's a senior attorney. And listen to this, John. We have got a National Law Center on homelessness and poverty. The fact that we need something like that in America says enough.
Yeah, that says a lot about us.
Well, he's the lead researcher on the new report on tent cities, and he breaks all this down for us next. I think it's an important episode for you to hear. So here it is on America Trends. Joining us on America Trends podcast is Eric Tars. He's a senior attorney and a lead researcher on a very important subject called Tent City, U.S.A. And he works for the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. And it's unfortunate that we need to have permanent institutions dealing with a problem like homelessness, but it doesn't seem to be abating in our midst at all. In fact, it's just the opposite, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. I think we'd all like to believe that here in America, if we were facing challenges or crises, that the community around us would step up and help us through with respect and compassion. That's how we as Americans believe our communities should work, that we share responsibility for each other and we come together to face the challenges in front of us. But right now in America, we have a problem that although the recession has ended for Wall Street, it hasn't ended for Main Street, and the economy's gains are not making it down to those who need it the most. Housing costs keep on going up, but people's wages don't, and that's why we've seen an explosion in the number of homeless encampments across the country. More than 1,300% in the past 10 years, according to the research that we've just done. And we're seeing things like the majority of California renters paying more than 30% of their income on rent each month, and 1/3 of them paying more than half their income each month in the rent. And that puts them just one missed paycheck, one household emergency away from a slide into homelessness and being the next resident of one of those tent cities.
Well, Eric, you know that the stereotype is, well, there's somebody who's really just down and out on their luck. They might have a substance abuse problem. But you are saying, and this study confirms, that a lot of the people we're talking about, they are homeless because they just can't afford to live in a permanent domicile. That's right.
We've had a 40-year disinvestment in affordable housing. This started back in the 1980s. The HUD budget, the federal housing budget for affordable housing was cut in half, and that money was never made up at the state or local level. And in the meantime, that just means every year for the past 40 years, people have not been, there has not been enough affordable housing production going into place. All these communities assume that if you only build luxury condominiums and you only build huge McMansions, that you're only going to get wealthy people moving to your community and growing your tax base. But in the meantime, the people who already live in your community, who aren't those wealthy people, are just getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. Their rents are going up, they're doubling up, tripling up in unstable situations. And again, that just puts them one emergency away from something that, they might have a small safety net. They might be able to call on a friend or a family member for a little while, but eventually those family safety nets can give out, and then those people end up out on the streets.
Well, people believe, I think, mistakenly, that there's a lot of nonprofit organizations out there, and their shelters are just ready to take in anybody who's in need, or that the government somehow is doing this. Yet, you're telling us in this report, Tent City, U.S.A., that these encampments are everywhere. I mean, we're not just talking about the large metropolitan centers. We're talking about all over the country. So who's fallen down here?
It's as I said, it's a problem that started at the federal level, and we used to, as Americans, Franklin Roosevelt said we have a second Bill of Rights. We believe that no American should have to go without a decent home, without access to the basic necessities of life. But in the 1980s, that kind of social contract that we had with our fellow Americans was broken, and as I said, it's never been made up for since at either the state or the local level. Had studies done at the state level, at the local level, demonstrating that we need to be producing more deeply affordable housing in our communities, but instead the incentives go to developing high-end housing. And again, it's a shared responsibility, but it's this collective failing of our government at all levels and the choices that they are making that are the primary cause of the growth of encampments. It's not the individual choices of homeless people who are usually blamed. It's their choices, the bad choices that they've made, that are the cause of them being there. No, it's the choices that we've all made to ignore the growth of this problem.
Well, I've got to say that your report is quite fascinating, and there are some parts of it that are counterintuitive. I think a lot of people might not imagine this. But you say that we have many of these individuals who, instead of getting help and assistance, are finding their way into the criminal justice system. So for being poor or not having enough money because the housing is not available to them and they find themselves out in the streets, that they are being penalized for this.
A huge growth of what we call the criminalization of homelessness. And these are laws and policies that are used to push homeless people out of public view temporarily, but the political incentives are all off here. It takes a lot of political will to create affordable housing, to get it cited and fight zoning battles with neighborhoods who don't want affordable housing in their community, even though there are studies that show that it doesn't bring down housing values. The alternative is you can quickly pass a law that says it's illegal to camp on the sidewalk or to sleep on the sidewalk, and you can hide the costs of that criminalization in the police budget, in the jail budget. And even when those things end up costing 2 to 3 times more than the cost of actually providing affordable housing would be, because it's something that has an immediate effect and you don't have to fight those other political battles, it becomes more politically expedient for people to do that. And so that's what we've been seeing going on across the country.
And you know that there are a lot of average citizens who just say, I want this out of sight, I want it out of mind, and so do what you need to do. And these communities are responding with these enforcement approaches.
Exactly. And so that's part of why we are, in fact, taking a new approach for our organization in this report. We previously, took a very strong position. We did not want to support the growth of legalized homeless encampments. We thought that communities, that accepting homeless encampments was accepting the existence of the problem, and that we should be focusing our resources on permanent housing options. That's the solution to homelessness. But we are recognizing that there are communities that are trying to do the right thing and create the long-term housing options that people need, but they can't maintain the political will to do that if people don't also see immediate improvement, that being the person on the sidewalk in front of your school, in front of your store, if that person is still there. And so we think that if communities can create encampments in a principled way that respects the needs and the demands of the people who are actually going to be living in them and the rights of the people who are actually going to be living in them, then that can actually help those people in an immediate sense, and it can also help take the pressure off of communities to be investing in these negative, destructive criminalization approaches and free up the resources to be able to be invested into the housing, and that's going to be the permanent solution.
What does that organized effort in a city look like?
It can take various forms. We lay out 6 principles in our report for how communities should be approaching encampments. And the first is the principle that every person needs a place to be both day and night, and to store their belongings, to have access to basic sanitation and hygiene. And, so how that happens in any given community can vary and should vary according to the local circumstances. In some, it might mean that there's more shelter created. In some, it might mean that they can move people directly into housing. And in some, it might mean that they set aside safe parking lots where people who are living in their cars can stay. It might mean that they set aside a safe place where an encampment can happen, or that they inform people where it is safe and legal that they can lay down their sleeping bag each night. So it can take a variety of different forms, but if we apply these principles, if the cities are applying the principles, then we think they'll come out with outcomes that are respectful of the civil and human rights of the people out on the streets, and as well as creating the conditions where we can create the permanent solutions, the permanent housing solutions that our communities need.
In your report, Tent City, USA, I was taken by the various reasoning of those who are out in the streets as to why they don't want to leave the encampments that they have built, and the fact that as many of them don't have all the conditions that you're talking about, but they have built something of a community. Explain to somebody listening why it is that somebody might not want to leave that kind of environment.
Sure, and we have this example right now in a case that we've brought in Houston, where the city is threatening to evict people from homeless encampments, and they say, well, there's shelter space available. The fact that there happens to be maybe one shelter bed available does not mean that that bed is actually accessible to any given individual. That means that a person who has a place, not a secure place, not a legal place, but a semi-secure tent where they can store their belongings and go around and do their daily activities because they know other people in the encampment will be able to watch their tent, would have to give up that tent in order to be able to stand in line probably across town for the chance of getting one of those shelter beds. And if they don't get that bed that night, then they have to go back across town. The shelter may be, just a bunch of mats on a gym floor. It might be in a setting where somebody, a veteran with PTSD or a domestic violence survivor, does not feel safe and secure. They might not allow pets or partners, marital partners, to come with you and be with you. So there's any number of reasons why just because a bed might exist, it's not accessible to a given individual. And then that's on top of the problem that in many cities there simply aren't enough shelter beds even available. So for many people, it actually does make more sense for them to have a safe, secure place where they can keep their belongings. When you check into one of these shelters, in many cases, you have to give up all of your belongings. You can't bring things in with you. The most you can bring in with you is one book, the Bible, and you have to check your cell phone at the door. People are worried about theft. There's, often bed bugs and other problems. So there's so many reasons why shelter beds aren't the solution that everybody thinks they are, and why living in an encampment is, not really a choice, but it's the best option that people see presented to them.
I thought it was really interesting as you described all of those reasons, including the fact that some are only for women, some are only for men, of course, some where children are encouraged to be part of the mix and others where they're not, and a whole range of things. And you brought in the religious aspect from time to time, too. I had never really thought about this. I think many of us really have not given a lot of thought to this issue. But I tell you, I know you were talking about some of the criminal justice elements to this, and where we have now made this something that really victimizes, in a sense, the homeless. But I was reading in Atlanta where people are going to help individuals in these various encampments, and they are finding that they, too, are actually being arrested for being helpful as enablers, and about 40 cities nationwide had active laws to restrict food sharing in these various communities and encampments. That kind of stunned me.
Yeah, it's particularly perverse. We've heard the messaging that, housing people, feeding people shouldn't be a government obligation. It should be a charitable obligation. But then those very people, those very charities who go out and try to do that work are also being criminalized and penalized for trying to do it. And so, you're really damned if you do and damned if you don't. And we actually had a meeting with one of the top UN human rights officials who's seen the worst of the worst all around the world. And when we explained that there are actually laws in this country where people are criminalized for trying to share food with homeless individuals, her head just went down on the table in front of her, and she couldn't believe it. Like, this is the situation that we have in our country today.
It's pretty surprising. We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And stay in touch with us on both Facebook and Twitter at Trends Podcast. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. You also point out in your report that using the criminal justice system and other municipal resources to move people who have nowhere to go can be very expensive. You pointed to other things that cities are doing, spending thousands of dollars on fences, bars, rocks, spikes, and other hostile architecture, deliberately making certain areas of their community inaccessible. Where's the pressure to do that? I mean, what are people hearing from the citizens in these communities, and how many are outraged that we don't have enough housing or we don't have enough shelter or whatever it may be, as opposed to saying, do whatever you need to do, but get that encampment out of my community?
Yeah, again, it's really the quick fix versus solving the problem kind of pressure. Say we've got the Pro Bowl coming up, or we've got some big sporting event that we want to have our city looking clean for. So get that encampment out of here because we don't want the rest of the world thinking that we have poverty in our community.
Yeah, that's what they did in, I think it was, was it Argentina for the Olympics and other places? They generally do these kinds of sweeps.
Yes. Well, and in every city across the U.S. as well. Every NBA game, every Major League Baseball Pro All-Star game, whoever the host city is, the Final Four, you can bet that they are trying to clean out their homeless encampments before that happens. And in some places, Philadelphia, for example, for the Democratic National Convention before the Pope came to visit a few years ago, they actually did it in quite a positive way where they worked to increase the resources to get people into housing. But in most communities, they simply push people out of the places where they are into less safe, less secure places. They don't give them an alternative place to go. It disrupts their relationships with the community that they have. It disrupts their relationships with service providers who might be trying to get them out of housing. And instead, as you say, they may invest tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in these hostile architecture, throwing down stones or spikes or fences to keep people out of certain areas. And it's simply incredible that they're willing to make those kinds of investments that could keep people in housing for months, if not years, but they won't make the investments in getting people off the streets permanently. But they'll do it for the quick fix.
And by the way, this is Eric Tars. He's a senior attorney for the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty and a lead researcher on this report, which is really fascinating, called Tent City, U.S.A. And I will say, if anybody thinks this is a blue or red issue, it's not. I mean, if you look at California, where most of the homeless encampments, I mean, that's where the largest concentration of them are. They have acknowledged for a decade, you say in your report, that they need to build approximately 180,000 units of new housing a year, but they have been building less than half of that. So California can't keep up. And this is not a warm weather, cold weather divide. This is not a blue state, red state. This is all over the country.
It's all over the country, and as we said, whether you are coming at it from a moral angle or a fiscal angle, criminalizing homelessness doesn't make sense. We have seen a number of states like Utah, some cities in very red states like Charlotte, North Carolina, where they've really found that investing in housing is a fiscal conservative solution, not just a social liberal solution. The data really supports that providing housing costs 2 to 3 times less than just simply leaving people out on the streets or much less than criminalizing them. So it should be something that everybody can get behind. But at the local level, the red-blue divide kind of disappears when you have homeless people on the streets, and there's just pressure from the business community, from housed residents who don't want to see or have to deal with that visible poverty in their community. And so we see, very quote-unquote liberal cities, Berkeley, San Francisco, L.A., as some of the ones that have taken the highest approach towards criminalizing homelessness.
That might surprise some people listening to this. You do point out that some of those cities that are ending the encampments by way of better housing include Charleston, South Carolina, Indianapolis, Indiana, Charleston, West Virginia, and some other places that are starting to get this. What is the trend in this country? I mean, you told us at the beginning that the trend was that we saw more of these encampments, but is there a movement toward a more humane approach to all of this through some of the principles that you outlined earlier in the podcast?
We are hoping that is the trend that we are starting. Certainly, there is a growing awareness of the size and the scale of the problem. And to date, we have only seen an increase in the amount of criminalization that's going on across the country. We've documented over the past 10 years the growth of anti-sleeping, anti-camping, anti-panhandling kinds of ordinances. But we do have these examples that we share in our report. We share a number of case studies, and again, not from necessarily the places that you might think, but of places that are taking positive steps. Nobody is doing it perfectly, for sure, but there are a number of communities that are taking more constructive steps, and that we hope that by looking at our report, people can get inspired by it by joining our national Housing Not Handcuffs campaign at housingnothandcuffs.org. We have seen a huge wave of support for policies that take a non-criminalization approach and instead provide a housing approach. It's been endorsed by folks like former Attorney General Eric Holder and a number of county and city officials. So we are hoping that we are seeing a changing of the trend, but it's still very early in turning that tide.
What about those who are on the streets and they also have mental illness? How does that complicate the situation?
Well, sure. Our jails have become our default mental hospitals in this country. There was a huge deinstitutionalization of people experiencing mental illness in the 1970s and 80s, and they were supposed to be transitioned into more community-based settings, but that never actually happened, and instead they transitioned out into the streets, and that's kind of another piece of the growth of modern homelessness. Most of the people who are homeless are just people who have lost housing due to economic reasons. You don't see them on the streets because they are trying to pass as normal as they can. So the ones you do see, there's kind of this overrepresentation of the ones who have mental illness, who have other problems that make it very obvious, and that's where you get these stereotypes from. But and they do have very specific needs that do need to be addressed. But I do want to emphasize that they are not the majority. But those who do have mental health needs, certainly putting them into a jail setting, often where they have no access to the medications, or if you sweep their encampment and take their medications away from them, that they might have helped to be getting them stabilized, those aren't going to be things that actually help them get out of homelessness.
Well, the report does talk about some very interesting approaches, a permanent encampment with a co-located service center in Las Cruces, New Mexico. You talk about religious organizations allowed to temporarily host encampments. A lot of people are talking about these pods that people can put in their backyards. We did a piece on Nomad Land about a lot of elderly citizens finding themselves on the road in their RVs because they have been displaced. And yet you talk about the fact that there are places that permit various kinds of encampments, if you will, in various parking areas. And then, of course, there are the attempts in certain communities for rent control. So there's a lot that goes on out there that I think people are not aware of, and they may want to check what's going on in their own community. And before we close, you're an attorney, Eric. Where are the courts as it relates to the rights of individuals who are displaced and in encampments? What's the law saying to us?
Well, the trend in the law is generally, in recent years, in favor of the rights of people who are living in encampments. It's not saying that they can live there permanently, but that at a minimum, people need to be given notice before they are evicted from an encampment so that they have time to gather up their belongings and move somewhere else. That cities, if they do confiscate belongings, can't just throw them all in the back of a trash truck, but they need to store them for certain periods of time and make sure that people can actually access them. We see a lot of people who lose identification documents, other things that people need to get out of homelessness when these encampments are swept. And the trend against panhandling laws is certainly very strong. Since 2015, every single panhandling law that's been challenged has been struck down. So the trend in the courts is generally against criminalizing homelessness, and that's yet another reason why communities, rather than trying to take that quick out and ending up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on litigation, should be instead looking for more constructive solutions and better approaches.
Eric Tars, I thank you for being with us today on America Trends. He is with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. If people want to get to you or to read this report, how can they do that?
It's at our website, nlchp.org, and we're happy to share it with people.
Thank you. An important topic, and one that, again, I don't think a lot of people have spent a lot of time thinking about, and yet there are so many people who are involved in one way or another. And it's a topic that from time to time we do hear something about, but I hope we've added to the public dialogue today. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Eric, thank you.